We'll be looking at the interwar years from pretty much from 1919 to 1939 with a focus on Europe. As we go through this material, we want to understand how European politics became realigned during this time, the role of reparations, and the Great Depression, especially in terms of destabilizing governments and giving rise to totalitarian regimes. And as we look at these, we will be focusing on three major ones in Europe, Italy, Germany, and Russia. We want to see how their, ideology worked, but also their economic policies. We want to be able to connect these together, ideology and economic policy, and our understanding of how it led us in a direction that eventually became World War II. And then, of course, we want to see, how did international conflict begin again when European powers, their Asian allies and their North American allies, were supposed to have just finished fighting a war to win all wars, a war to basically make the world safe for democracy. So you need to understand that coming out of World War I, a number of these countries experienced kind of a shock, if you will. So some countries like France lost a large portion of their young men of fighting age, lost civilians as well. Due to the fighting of World War I along the Western Front that just ravaged their countryside. For many Europeans and others that fought in this conflict, the horrors of war brought into question jingoism, this form of super hyped patriotism that praised the nation state above all else and denigrated the homelands and the cultures of other peoples. Now, for some countries like Germany, it was a very deep wound to World War I. In the case of the Weimar Republic, as they call it, the civilian government that emerged following the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, these folks had to create a representative government in a country that was used to authoritarian rule in a time of national crisis, both in terms of identity, politics, military, and societal. And this was going to be a very big issue because, one of the things that's not really understood about the armistice that was signed was that it was largely kept out of the eyes of the people. You had the military leaders, the political leaders that were meeting with their Western counterparts. They devised the basis for an armistice. The armistice was signed right at the time of the abdication of the Kaiser, when the civilian government was coming into power. It was signed in, some backwoods area, close to the fighting. And so for many Germans, the view was like this civilian government that had just came to power immediately turned around when the Germans were possibly on the brink of victory and betrayed their nation by signing this armistice. So as a young government really beginning an experiment in democracy in the German state, right off the bat they had to face a lot of civil unrest. And again, the civil unrest had a lot to do with how World War I ended for them. There was unemployment, there were shortages, there was, of course, the grieving loss of national pride and of the soldiers during the course of the war. In people's anger, they turned, in some cases, to extremist organizations, whether they were right-wing fascist groups like the fledgling Nazi Party or other patriotic organizations that were operating, or their opposites, their parts, the Communist Party. There were many organizations that were very much anti-democratic, anti-parliamentary, organizations that advocated the end of civilian rule and a return as well to more strong-armed governments along the line of that which they experienced under the German Reich. In addition to that, the German Republic lost one of its fundamental institutions. Keep in mind that the military under the old Prussian system was a time-honored institution. Usually, if you wanted to go anywhere in politics, it was expected that you would have some sort of a career, and a dignified and successful career at that in the Prussian military. And now suddenly this military experienced one of the biggest defeats that that really they had experienced beyond the 1800s. And it not only led to a defeat, but as part of the Versailles Treaty, the German military was greatly reduced in size. They really could not have any heavy weaponry, any fighting aircraft. Their naval fleet was basically wiped out, all as terms of the Versailles Treaty. So this institution that could be viewed as somewhat stabilizing was also taken from them. And then there's the issues of reparations. Right off the bat, these reparations were devastating to the German economy. In fact, you could say that Great Britain, Italy, and France intentionally designed these reparations in a spirit of vengeance, but also with the full knowledge that it would devastate the economy. And with a devastated economy and limitations on the military, the idea was that Germany would never again rise as an economic or a military competitor to them. So what basically happened is that the reparations forced Germany out of the global economy. And on top of that, they really became an issue that German politicians, had a hard time dealing with. On the one hand, they realized that they had to pay these reparations if they ever hoped to reemerge as an economic power again. But the question was, first of all, how to repay them. And the second problem with it was that this could have a devastating impact on one's political career. In fact, there were assassinations of prominent politicians simply for their public stance on repaying and living up to the burdens of the Versailles Treaty. Now, one unexpected consequence of these reparations for the former Allied powers was the direction they ended up pushing Germany into. Basically, Germany had become a pariah during this time. It was not admitted into the League of Nations. It was not considered an equal in any sense of the word by other European powers. So the Germans turned toward the other European pariah and outcast, which was Russia, and communist Russia at that. And so what they did is they signed the Rapallo Treaty. And under this treaty, it basically gave the Russians a trading partner in the form of Germany. And for the Germans, it gave them access to a country that was not under any obligation to the League of Nations or any of the arms limitation treaties. And so we actually see some of the early stages of German rearmament, with them secretly training German troops and, manufacturing German arms within Russian borders. Now, what this led to were a series of economic crises within Germany. And it basically caused so many problems that inflation with Germany quickly became out of control. So it was not unheard of during some of the worst moments of these crises for Germans to basically have to work and then try to pay their bills with worthless currency. So we oftentimes talk about how German workers would go to work in the morning, get their paycheck, run to the store, and buy what they needed or pay their rent, because by the morning their pay would be worthless. And it might seem that this is hyperbolic speech, but it really isn't. So if you look at this picture right here, this is a child who is not playing with, toy bricks. These are actually stacks of Reichsmarks of German currency. That's basically your pay pretty much at the end of the day. So there were a number of times when the German government had to go through, completely get rid of an old currency, start fresh with a new currency, only to see inflation starting once again. So what this ended up doing is it brought the United States of America into the mix. Keep in mind that the Americans were trying to retreat back under their policy of isolationism, but there were times when events would become so out of hand that they really had no choice but to re-engage. And so what the United States of America did is it came out and worked as kind of an arbiter, and it had the ability to do this since it was a major creditor of the British, the French, and the Italians. And what they ended up succeeding in was establishing what was called the Dawes Plan. And this got the Allied powers to agree to what were considered reasonable payments by the German people over a longer period of time to pay down their debt. And this would in turn help stabilize the German economy. And one of the ways that it did it was the United States government basically guaranteed to Britain, France, and Italy, as well as Germany, access to somewhat friendly American loans. And so what happened right here is we see one of the problems, if you watched my lecture on the Great Depression, with the banking sector in the global economy. Young John Maynard Keynes, an economist who had really just kind of started his career here, who was responsible for putting forth the economic theories that really became the foundation, the intellectual foundation for deficit spending through much of the 20th century, priming the pump, infusing government dollars into a flagging economy as a way to lessen the extremes of recessions. In looking at this, he basically said that what the signatories of the Dawes Plan had built was a house of cards, because you had the U.S. loaning money to all these powers, and then all these powers were then turning around and using them to pay off their wartime debts, which was a very fragile basis for a global economic system. Now, finally, by the mid to late 1920s, the Allied powers did relent on their position vis-a-vis Germany. And in the Locarno agreements, they allowed Germany to re-enter the League of Nations, re-enter as a peer among nations. And of course, the Germans did agree to continue paying their reparations. And this allowed Germany, again, more stability in which to rebuild their society. Now, at the same time that this was happening, within Germany, you had what we would consider to be conflicts of culture. German culture at this time was very vibrant. It was a place of artistic movements that greatly influenced other countries. We see here some of the prominent works presented by German artists and architects during their time period. German artists, as you can see from the right-hand side, were involved in everything from the Dadaist movement to Cubism, all the avant-garde musical styles. You could find German musicians playing the latest jazz tunes in local bars. You did have an LGBTQ community that had some degrees of freedom within German society. And then, of course, the Bauhaus movement, the bottom left picture on the screen. This was an architectural movement that greatly influenced architectural movements in the rest of the world. So if you go to Chicago, for example, you'll see the Art Deco movement that really shaped the historic buildings of much of Chicago. In Art Deco, it tends to be very heavy with its stonework, but while it has very heavy stonework, it also has some very intricate sculptures, facades, and the way that the building is presented to the public from the exterior. Bauhaus kind of took a different approach to that, and as you can see in one of these principal buildings, Bauhaus tried to de-emphasize heavy stonework in exchange for more openness. So whereas Art Deco, very heavy in terms of stonework, Bauhaus is very delicate because it basically replaces a lot of this heavier construction material with steel and glass, and really opens up to the interior of the building to the outside. And when we look at this Bauhaus structure, we can very much see the origins of a lot of structures, a lot of skyscrapers that came to dominate the skyline of places like New York City. But at the same time that you had this vibrant culture within Germany, you did have groups that were very much against it. They saw these cultural movements, the introduction of jazz, this new art form, as a pollution of the German spirit, of the German character, just as they viewed parliamentary politics as decadent, wasteful, useless, pointless, unable to give the structure necessary for good, orderly German lives. And deep in the heart of this counter movement to these developments was none other than Adolf Hitler and his friends that he was meeting with as a young and still unknown of politician. Now, the Great Depression broke down on Europe, just as it did in the United States of America on Black Thursday and Black Tuesday with the collapse of the stock market. But really, the Great Depression, we recognize that it did begin before that. As we know today, especially following the Great Recession in 2008, economic catastrophes of this magnitude don't just suddenly begin out of nowhere. Usually there are telltale signs leading up to it, whether it was housing prices and some of the overvalued stocks in the stock market, or the overabundance of some subprime mortgages that we saw going into 2008. If we look back to the Great Depression, we can see collapsing agricultural prices, as well as collapsing banks in Central Europe in the months leading up to the actual stock market collapse, as harbingers of what was about to come. So the Great Depression, there are a number of different causes involved in it, from unsound banking practices to problems in agricultural prices, housing prices, a weakened German state, limitations on international trade by the various tariffs that were thrown up to protect the domestic markets of a number of leading economies. All of these things contributing to the nightmare that would unfold starting late 1929. And in Europe, this had a profound impact. Right off the bat, what were once considered extremist fringe movements on the right that were largely ignored or weren't given much credence to suddenly became appealing to disaffected farmers and workers, and especially college students trying to make it in society. So here, we witness in the early 1930s, suddenly in Germany, for example, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party going from really a small fringe movement to a viable political party. And Germany wasn't alone in this. You actually saw fascist organizations cropping up in France, in Great Britain, even in the streets of the United States of America. So what would basically happen is in areas that did not have a history with representative governments, in regions where you had a deeper and longer history of, heavy-handed government going all the way back to absolute monarchies in the 1600s, 1700s, they're going to turn back to what they viewed as the glory days of their past. They're going to turn back to what they saw as working for them before. And this, of course, is totalitarian government. On the other hand, you will have governments that have had a longer history of representative government, participatory politics. They did maintain their traditions and viewed this rise of fascism with alarm. But keep in mind, democracy is never guaranteed to a people. It's something that must be worked for and renewed continuously. And so people within these societies would have to work. They did have to work to maintain their democracies in the face of even growing support for fascism at home. So what basically happened is responses to government largely followed one of two paths. There were militaristic societies that basically said, okay, we are going to do some infrastructure projects. We're going to try to fight unemployment, but at the same time, we're going to build up our militaries. We're going to make our militaries grand and powerful. And so a lot of the money that they were pouring into their economy was poured into armaments factories and was tied up in the recruitment and training of large bodies of soldiers. You then had, on the other hand, societies that took an industrial route. These are societies that decided, okay, we want to, build on a massive scale bridges and roads and civic buildings. We want to use this money that we're pumping in at large amounts to our economy to hopefully kickstart our consumer society, our entertainment industry, and get people buying things again. And so you can really kind of see this in the extremes taken of two different powers at this time. You had the Germans, on the one hand, that would go from a very small military in the 1920s to the largest military going into World War II, and one of the most highly trained ones with some of the best equipment on hand. The Americans, on the other hand, entered the early phases of World War II with armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands at most. Instead, all of their manpower mobilized by the federal government was in federal entities like the Public Works Administration, Works Progress Administration, the National Youth Administration, Civilian Corps, Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the building of the Grand Coulee Dam, and a number of other civic works projects. And so when it came to time to reap the benefits, in the case of the United States and other industrial societies like the United Kingdom, the United States of France, it was all about getting consumer spending going again and exporting your products abroad. Italy, Germany, and Japan and Russia, on the other hand, they viewed recovery as quintessentially tied to the expansion of their borders. So in the case of the Russians, regaining territory that they lost as a result of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. In the case of Italy, it was expanding their borders to the glories of the Roman Empire. For the Germans, it was Anschluss and Lebensraum, as we'll look at here in a second. And for Japan, it was expanding the territory of the land of the rising sun, deep into the Pacific Ocean, but especially into China. Now, when we look at fascism, fascism did not begin in Germany, although when you look at documentaries about fascism, oftentimes it is the Germans that we turn to, that we look at the most. Really, if you want to look at one of the earliest successes of fascism, and actually a model that Adolf Hitler himself followed and other fascists followed, it's Italy, and this guy right here, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, similar to Adolf Hitler, found himself in a post-World War I Italian society that was in disarray, that experienced some economic problems as a result of the war, had large groups of former veterans, experiencing what veterans usually do after large conflicts, which is, reintegrating into society, finding employment. And in this mix, they also experienced the rise of workers' unions and syndicates, socialist parties, and following the Russian Revolution, the growth of the popularity in communism. And so Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, as he was likened, he came to the head of a group in Italian society known as the Fasci di Combattimento, which we just refer to as the fascists. And this was basically a group of men who disliked parliamentary government. It disliked, this new decadence in society, disliked the workers' movements that were sprouting up. And so what they did is they organized themselves into a paramilitary group that, often wore black, and the skull and the crossbones was kind of their emblem, if you will. And then what they would do is they would go out and they would hire themselves to large landowners and large industrialists, and they would violently put down strikes by workers and demonstrations by socialists or more communists. And the ideology that emerges with Mussolini is that of the corporate state. So basically the state would direct and control a lot of the private enterprise. So this is where fascism, a lot of people like to link fascism with communism. It's not, it is and it isn't similar. On the one hand, you still had private ownership of businesses within German and Italian society, but there was a lot of cooperation between the two. There was business working at the behest of state needs and state interests. So one thing that the fascist government did is it established boards, kind of corporate boards, if you will. And these boards were basically comprised of business interests, representatives of business interests, the state interest, and then representatives of what they would call the workers' interests, but really they weren't workers' representatives in the sense of what we would consider a union. In addition to this kind of restructuring of society, the state was the end concern, the chief concern of society at large. So the state did not exist to meet the needs of the people. The people existed to meet the needs of the state. And one need that Mussolini believed was essential was the need to expand one's borders. So in the architectural projects that they commissioned, in their state propaganda, and in their visions for the future, they always had as a central goal the reconstitution of the old Roman Empire under the fascist banner. Now, what basically happened is they started off as, this paramilitary group, and then they made themselves indispensable to some of the chief conservative political parties and business interests, through their actions against striking workers. And they used their propaganda wing to amass a following. And then eventually this got them their doorway into politics. And the final moment kind of came in October 1922 when Mussolini and other leaders of the fascist party engineered this March on Rome, which was supposed to be the spontaneous descending of all fascist groups onto Rome, where in an orderly manner Mussolini marched in and just seized power in a very peaceful manner, to a lot of pomp and ceremony. But we know today that this wasn't the case. There was actually a lot of negotiation between Mussolini and the fascists and the parliamentary forces and the monarchy to allow this takeover of power. And it wasn't spontaneous. It was this was a planned parade, if you will, to garner popular support. And then once in political power, the fascists then worked to consolidate their power over police forces, over the military, to basically outlaw other political powers, any challengers to their authority. And it was this consolidation, once they had their foot in the door, that allowed them to seize ultimate control over the Italian state. Now, another organization that quickly consolidated and rose to power was the Communist Party in Russia. So, as we saw from World War I, the Russians descended into civil war during World War I as a result of the shortages people faced in the home front, the massive loss of life that civilians viewed as generals just in a very uncaring way, just sacrificing their sons to a war effort that was not viewed as benefiting the common man. In addition to that, the Tsarist government had abolished serfdom, but the common worker, the average Russian, never really truly escaped serfdom. It never truly escaped the aristocracy, the controls of the Tsarist government, or businessmen and merchants. So there was still a lot of widespread suffering. There was a lot of calls, even amongst the business groups, for representative government that the Tsarist government never responded to. And so in spring of 1917, this finally came to a head with the first Russian Revolution, which overthrew and introduced elements of civilian government, followed by a fall revolution when the civilian government refused to or failed to get the Russians out of the conflict. And it was the second revolution that the people turned to the Bolsheviks, or the minority party within the Russian Communist Party, that was led by the figure on top there, the top photograph, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin. And Lenin, when he and the Bolsheviks came into power, one of the things they did is they quickly acted while they had support to get rid of any of the last vestiges of aristocracy and Tsarist government. So right off the bat, Nicholas II and the last remaining Romanovs, especially the royal family, were executed. The Tsar and his government themselves were under house arrest, just basically taken down into the basement, executed on the spot. The idea was to erase any links to this form of government so that the Russian people would never have to face the possibility of falling under its control again. And then during the course of the war, the Bolshevik Party and the Red Army targeted the White Army, which was comprised of supporters of democracy, Western-style governments, as well as some of the last of the aristocrats found in society. It was under this time period that Lenin introduced, first of all, war communism. So this was Marxist ideology in its purest form, where the Bolsheviks quickly acted to completely nationalize all private property, all business, all farms. Now, war communism quickly led to shortages, it led to hardships, and so what Lenin and the Communist Party had to do is they had to learn to compromise. So under the new economic policy, or NEP, what they basically did is they said, okay, there will be some limited privatization. Smaller businesses, smaller farms can remain in the hands of private individuals. What we're going to focus on instead are large business interests. Those will fall under communist control. And of course, under Lenin, they introduced as well the early police state with the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB and other government controls over everyday life. He also reorganized the Russian Empire into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So one of the things that the Russian communists liked to do was to always portray this image of mass participation of the people in the communist project, in the communist ideal. Lenin, if you read his earliest writings, talked about the will of the people, participation of the people, etc. But he believed that you had to have, for a successful government and workers' revolution, a small group of intelligentsia that led the efforts. And for Lenin and these endeavors, that was the Communist Party. So the Communist Party would lead, and the people, in his mind, would gladly follow their efforts. So there was an attempt to create kind of a democratic, visage of the communist people, the communist society. A lot of propaganda under the Soviets would always depict workers gladly and heroically laboring for a true egalitarian workers' ideal. We know today this was not always the case. Anybody that, really starting under Lenin, protested or spoke out against them or organized against them, quickly found themselves under arrest and facing potential execution or exile to a gulag, which in and of itself you could say was a form of execution, at least of social execution. So the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, all of the different republics quote unquote voluntarily linked together into one organization, the USSR. And it was this organization or this political entity that would emerge as the Soviet political power in the world. Now, Lenin didn't live long to see the Soviet ideal, really live beyond the Russian Civil War. And he would eventually pass away to ill health. And in his passing, the individual photo shown in the photograph on the bottom, Joseph Stalin, rose to power. Now, initially, Lenin did not want this to happen. In fact, a lot of communists viewed Leon Trotsky, who was Lenin's intellectual equivalent, both in mental capacity as well as in his views on what a communist state should be. They viewed Leon Trotsky as the rational successor. But instead, Joseph Stalin quickly acted to get support within the Communist Party. And again, this was against Lenin's wishes. In fact, Lenin left us a letter left the Russians a letter that stated that under no circumstance should Stalin ever come to power. But Stalin, quickly after Lenin's death, seized the letter, consolidated power within the Communist Party, and then worked to sideline the supporters of Lenin. And under Joseph Stalin, really his ideology was power. It was a cult of personality. Under Stalin, it was the ideology was his own power. It was a cult of his personality. He, in effect, through his control, just basically became the new communist czar, if you will. So that's what all of his actions were to do, to follow a communist ideal, to work for the worker, but really at the same time to hold on to power. So under Joseph Stalin, one of the things that he did was to work to purge the Russian people or the Russian government of all potential challengers to his view, his vision of what communism should be and of his control over the government. And this culminated in the late 1930s with the Great Purge, where he arrested millions of Russians simply under suspicion of supporting Trotskyites and opponents of Joseph Stalin. Many of them were brought before mock courts, quickly found guilty, and then with people that were viewed as the greatest threats to Stalin, their associates, family members were often executed. People that escaped this fate, quickly found themselves in a gulag, usually located in the more barren regions of Russia, especially in Siberia. And it's hard to place an exact number on how many people died in this, but historians estimate millions of Russians. Possibly upward about 8 million Russians died either through execution or through the slow death of the gulag as a result of the Great Purge. Now, in late 1920s, he also reversed course on NEP and went back to complete and total control over all aspects of business and property ownership in Russia. And he organized the economy around a series of 5-year plans starting in 1928. So every 5-year plan would start with quotas, with goals that they were going to hit. So the very first ones focused on industrialization because Russia, though a major power, it was still very weak economically. And so basically they would focus on the building of factories, focusing on producing so much crops a year, and the managers of these state companies and state farms were expected to meet these quotas. And this, in and of itself, is going to be where the fundamental problems of the Soviet economy began. Soviets were very capable in terms of producing world-class academics. Uh, some of their areas of culture, like ballet, was first class. They produced first-class chess players. Weaponry, they were able to produce some of the best weapons in the world. In fact, their heavily armored tanks were really the only ones that could withstand the Tiger tanks that the German military produced. So German military technology was always very good. What they couldn't produce was consumer items. Uh, Cars, for example, were laughable quality at best. They could never produce a very essential consumer demand, which was food. Food in of itself was, kind of limited to bare essentials for the majority of the people. Of course, people at the top of the party, they tended to enjoy the finer things in life. So their economic system from the beginning was very weak in terms of its flexibility, its ability to innovate in the consumer sector, as well as its economic freedoms to allow this. Some examples were that they would construct shoe factories with the intent of maintaining satellite states within the German economic orbit by building a left side shoe factory in one state, and the right-hand shoes, they would have a factory in another state. Just ridiculous experiments like that. Now, in terms of foreign policy, Lenin was a true internationalist. He established the Comintern, the Communist International. The idea was to link all communist parties located throughout the world together with Moscow, which would be viewed as their headquarters. And this is where they would organize the revolution of the workers in other states. Stalin, on the other hand, was not. He started off as an isolationist. He recognized the economic and the military weaknesses of the Russian people. And so what he said was, look, we're going to focus on socialism in one country, and that is Russia. So under him, he also established an autarky. He basically isolated the Russian communist government from the rest of the world, and this did help insulate them from the Great Depression. And then as the Russian borders would expand following the Russian abandonment of isolationism, especially in the days leading to and following World War II, these satellite countries would be brought into this connection with the Russian economy. Now, socialism in one country and autarky did not survive really through the 1970s of the Cold War. Eventually, it would prove inadequate. And the Russians did recognize that, yes, they did have to trade with countries like the United States to meet certain demands. And perhaps the biggest demand for this was food production. So they turned to American farmers to produce the grains necessary to feed their people, starting really in the 1970s. Now, the last major figure was Adolf Hitler, and he was kind of a Johnny-come-lately to the stage. Not much is known about Hitler's youth. Anybody that commits genocide on the level of Hitler, that can just accept the murder and the torture of so many millions of peoples. And people wonder why, historians wonder why, what led into it. And one of the things that they've tried to do over the decades following Hitler's suicide is to look, at root causes, especially amongst his youth. But there's not much known about Hitler's childhood. We know there was a lot of violence in the family, that there were some peculiarities amongst his parents. For example, his father was known to be very violent. His mom, we do know, for example, would oftentimes use deception with the father as a way to kind of deflect that violence away from the children. But aside from that, not much is known. Hitler did spend his youth as a failed artist in the streets of Austria. Keep in mind, he was an Austrian German. and he joined the German military, to fight in World War One. And there he proved himself a very capable officer. And like many other capable officers who sacrificed during World War One, they viewed the armistice as a betrayal of the German war effort and the German people. Now, Hitler's ideology can be found in Mein Kampf. It's the book that he wrote while in prison following the failed beer hall putsch in 1923. And anybody interested in reading this can, go through and dissect the Nazi ideology. Keep in mind, though, it is a very difficult read because it is just littered with anti-Semitism. So one of the things at the core of Mein Kampf was anti-Semitism. Basically, he viewed, if there was anything that went wrong in society, Hitler would pretty much blame Jews for it. To him, there was international Jewish conspiracies aimed at weakening German society and the German economy. So anti-Semitism is prevalent in it. In addition to that, he turns to this mythical figure of the Aryan as the true German archetype. So to him, the Aryan was the true German, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, disdainful of modern art, modern culture, disdainful of anything that smacked of Judaism, and that really emphasized individual willpower. So two of the greatest influences we can see on Hitler were the depictions of German culture through the operatic works of Richard Wagner. So the Germans would, do this kind of almost cultish, the Nazis would do this almost cultish studies of the German past, of German folklore, German mythology, and that was coupled in with Nietzsche's concept of the Übermann, the Superman, that was stripped away of all conventions, kind of enforced on him externally, and instead would follow his willpower and would change his destiny and blaze his own path just through the force of willpower alone. Now, in addition to that, their ideology also, like the fascist ideology, did embrace war as the end-all, be-all of state goals. In Anschluss and Lebensraum, this would be two of the primary motivating factors behind Nazi policy. So Anschluss was this policy of reuniting all German-speaking lands that had been taken from the German Reich during the course, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the course of the Versailles Treaty. So these were lands like the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, portions of Western Poland, just areas around Germany. So a form of irredentism. In Lebensraum, which translates to basically living space, was this view that this future German society would need new lands to expand and to enlarge their civilization. So this basically meant taking lands from their neighbor and then expanding the German society in there pretty much by emptying it of others. So Hitler, he in his early career began by joining the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Here's one of the things about it. The National Social German Workers' Party was kind of a small, obscure party that he and his like-minded associates joined up with, quickly took control over. And another aspect of Nazism, as it becomes known, is a Nazi concept of socialism. So don't liken Nazi socialism with the socialism practiced by socialist parties like the Socialist Party in America. I don't equate them with the Marxist ideology. In fact, Marxism was hated by Hitler. In fact, he viewed Marxism as part of this great Jewish conspiracy. To Nazis, socialism meant placing society above the individual. It meant individuals working to build a greater society, a society that would be purged of all of the unwanted elements. So that is what the Nazis meant by their form of socialism. So it's socialism more akin to the fascist concept of society above self, society above individual. Now, within the Nazi Party, as they organized, one of the things they brought to it is a very militaristic regimentation of its membership. So the different regions, Gauls were led by a Gauleiter, a regional leader, with Hitler at the very top. And then, of course, these regions were further subdivided down into, you get to the local parties. Like the fascists, the Nazis had in their early stage a paramilitary group that was called the Sturmabteilung, or the SA. These are the infamous brown shirts led by Ernst Röhm. And they were the ones that would go out and engage in street brawls with communists and would go out and violently attack worker strikes and other protest movements. And initially, the SA, as led by Ernst Röhm, caused Hitler some issues in his control over the party, because Ernst Röhm was a very charismatic figure. And also, one of the things about the SA is that homosexuality was openly practiced amongst some of its membership, and Ernst Röhm was one of them. And this was part of this new culture that Hitler viewed as very decadent. So one of the groups in society that the Nazis, quickly sent to concentration camps after their control or concentration of power in the German state were members of the LGBTQ community, as well as intellectuals, Nazi opponents, and Jewish citizens. So in the early 1930s, in the Night of the Long Knives, what Hitler did is he assassinated Ernst Röhm and consolidated the brown shirts directly under his control. And the brown shirts, these would later be fused into the German military, which would essentially become the Schutzstaffel, the SS, the elite German soldiers, and Hitler's personal bodyguard. So the ride to Nazi power, it started off in the streets, controlling the Nazi Party, expanding its membership, using the brown shirts to go out and attack workers' parties, communist groups, others. And then it went from a fringe group to a political party, and it was helped very much by the Great Depression. So a lot of people looking towards, strong arm government, to this strongman type leadership. I could find a refuge in the Nazi Party. Disillusioned college graduate males, looking for opportunity and hope. They returned often in large numbers to the Nazi Party. And they entered into politics and managed to get themselves elected to parliamentary seats. But alone, they never occupied more than, I would say, a third of the German Reich at its height. But what they managed to do was to use crises in power, in Hitler's charisma and charm, and the pomp of ceremony, that the Nazis were adept at, that they borrowed from Mussolini and the fascists, to get enough support to force Otto von Papen, the prime minister at the time, and President Paul von Hindenburg, to allow Hitler to become the chancellor of the Reichstag. And it was from here that, especially following the Reichstag fire in 1933, and following the death of Paul von Hindenburg, that Hitler first consolidated his power, got an emergency act passed by the Reichstag, and then systematically targeted one opposing party after another. So starting right off, he focused on just, really the communists, just the Social Democrat Party. Once they were eliminated, he then began to focus on opposition parties within society, intellectuals. He began his process of propaganda. During the Quds course, he consolidated the Nazi Party with other hardcore right-wing authoritarian groups and militaristic groups. He won over the support of the military by promising to rebuild their ranks and their military status to their former glory. And by the time the mid-1930s were over, and it happened rather quickly within a couple of years' time, really the only parties that were left were the center parties, the centrist parties. And it was very clear to them, especially when laws started to be passed that said, okay, if you want certain jobs, you have to be a member of the Nazi Party. Once this was a fait accompli, these remaining parties basically gave their consent and merged in with the Nazi Party. And at the same time as he was doing this, he was putting key figures and key positions in the economy, in the military, in police systems. And so like Mussolini consolidated his power through all parts of society. And so this is the evolution. This is his evolution from obscure, unknown leader of a fringe group to the Führer as he becomes known to history. So again, some of the key developments here in the consolidation of power, the Reichstag fire in 1933, which he blamed on communists. This allowed him to get the enabling bill passed that gave him extensive powers, which of course he promised to return once the crisis was over, which he never did. This allowed him to consolidate power outside the Nazi Party. Internally, 1934, this was the Night of the Long Knives, which he executed Ernst Röhm and other challengers within the Nazi Party, consolidating his own control. This, of course, followed by this was Hindenburg's death. So what Hitler now did is he merged his power as Chancellor of the Reichstag with the presidency to become the uncontested head of the German government, and then he began to target opposing parties. Now, right off the bat, again, anti-Semitism was very big within the Nazi ideology, and it was a theme found throughout much of Europe. So even within Russia before and after the communists rose to power, there were pogroms against Jews in Eastern Europe. There was social discrimination and political, economic discrimination of Jews in even parts of Western Europe. In the United States of America, Jews were discriminated against. They were one of those groups that were considered outside of the definition of what it meant to be white. And they themselves were often targeted by violence. So if we look at the Ku Klux Klan, that was prevalent starting in the southern states, but then quickly spread elsewhere. The Klan didn't, its main target was African American people, but they equally had propaganda that was anti-Semitic as well as anti-Catholic as well. And Hitler taps into this, and he starts off just by making it part of the general program. And his move towards his goal of removing Jewish people from German society and through society as a whole, it came in stages, just like he consolidated power in the Reichstag. So, you have the Nuremberg laws that, it took until 1935 for them to pass the Nuremberg laws, because they were working with propaganda to get people behind the German effort. And it was these Nuremberg laws that stripped Jews of the right to hold certain professions that forced them to wear the yellow Star of David, to identify, physically as a Jew, which forbade the intermarriage of Jews with non-Jews. So this was the stripping away of their human rights. Now, at the same time that they were doing this, Hitler was very much, espousing his eugenics views, his views that they could, eliminate unwanted elements of society, as he was doing with laws such as the Nuremberg laws, but that they could also, the government could interact with certain types of natalist policies to engineer the perfect Aryan citizen. And so one of the things that they did with their eugenics laws early on was the T4 initiative, T4 program. And what this did is it targeted people that Nazis viewed as biologically inferior. So what they would do is they would ask members of family members that had, families that had members that were mentally handicapped, physically handicapped, that had psychological disorders, to register and to bring their loved ones to certain hospitals. And they were promised, cutting edge treatments, for example. But unbeknownst in the earliest days to the family members, these patients were marked right off the bat with for euthanasia and for execution. And it was here that the Nazi Party first began experimenting with the techniques that they would later use during the Holocaust. So, for example, one of the tools that they later designed was a van that they would go and pick up people that they were taking to these hospitals. And the van had a cab in the back that was isolated, and they connected the cab to the tailpipe of the vehicle. And so they would load the person up, drive off, and the gas fumes would basically kill the passengers in the back. And these techniques pioneered here, but then later exported to the concentration camps and to the death camps. Now, from the Nuremberg laws, the Germans then further eroded Jewish rights, Jewish human rights, by forcing them into ghettos, usually run-down segments of or portions of societies that were overcrowded and had few to no amenities. Now, once in the ghettos, or as they were moving them into ghettos, as they were stripping them of rights, they also unleashed the German populace and all of the hatred and the scapegoatism of the German people and anti-Semitism on the Jewish population. And this culminated in 1938 with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which was a night of extreme German violence that citizens could and did inflict on Jewish citizens with impunity. So the burning of their buildings, the vandalism of their buildings, the physical assault of Jews found in the streets. And then during World War II, as World War II broke out, all vestiges of restraint were basically stripped away. And this is where we start to see the accelerated process of the move of Jewish families and people into concentration camps wherever they were found. So leading up to the stages, you did have concentration camps. And what the Nazis did in the early stages, they said, okay, well, what we're doing with these concentration camps is we're sending troublemakers to them. So, lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transsexuals, jazz musicians, people. Why jazz music, you might ask? Well, keep in mind that was it is an African American art form, and as such, it was viewed as a polluting factor, quote unquote, in the German effort to create the ideal Aryan state. So jazz musicians, opposition political leaders, anybody that spoke out against the Reich, as well as German Jews. And in the early days, they would actually go out and they would make these propaganda films where they would clean up the concentration camps and have Jewish residents, dressed up and portrayed as living these happy lives in these camps that were designed to allow Jews to live happy lives, when the reality was anything but. So going into World War II, they basically just dropped any pretense of this anymore, especially with incidents like Kristallnacht. And they began the process that eventually culminated with the Wannsee Conference of 1942, in which guys like Adolf Eichmann and Heinrich Himmler came up with the final solution. And this was the program whereby Jews found in German lands, Austria, former Czechoslovakia, Russia, anywhere that German control extended, Jews were ordered to be rounded up, registered, placed on the trains, and then this very intricate system of rail lines would then connect the different labor camps and death camps. So usually it would start off with Jews rounded up and taken to a processing camp. From the processing camp, those that were considered healthy enough were then sent off to the labor camps, where they were forced to produce goods for Nazi companies, Nazi arms merchants, etc. And those that were considered to be unfit, they were immediately sent off to the death camps. So usually the elderly, the infirm, and little children sent there. In some cases, such as Auschwitz, the death camp itself would be the primary camp, but then it would have a labor camp next to it. And the laborers in that camp were expected to basically maintain the death camp. So you have accounts of Jewish survivors of labor camps associated with some of these death camps that retell the horrors and provide eyewitness experiences of having to watch these trains unload of Jewish passengers, file into the death camp, knowing full what was about to happen to them. Laborers were then tasked with the process of sorting luggage and sorting goods, stripping gold from teeth extracted by executed Jewish prisoners. And then, of course, they would be the ones that would have to transport the bodies to the furnaces. And there are accounts of these laborers who had this job of participating in this, trying to at least say prayers over the victims, for example, to give them at least something of a dignity of in the following their deaths, in terms of religious rites. So it was a very traumatic event. And again, when this is the reason why usually we could talk extensively about Benito Mussolini. We could talk extensively about Adolf Hitler, any number of fascists in our studies of genocide and fascism. But why do we focus on Hitler? Well, it's a very easy answer there. It's the extent of his horrors. It provides the perfect case study for the problems behind eugenics, the problems behind racism and racist-driven political policies in the aftermath. And so here you can see some of the leading death camps and their associated labor camps, and the numbers that were killed, the types of gas that were used. You see the piles of, on the top photograph, German luggage, and then the mass graves that they used. And to be sure, We know today that the German people did know what was happening, or at least they suspected what was happening at these camps. It was kind of hard to miss if you had a city that was located outside of a death camp. Large trains full of people going in, empty trains coming out, smoke plumes raising up into the sky night and day, and no sign of any living sign, at least, of these human beings in the vicinity. So the Germans, they did try to cover up their misdeeds to an extent. One of the reasons why they did take time to burn the bodies and did move from mass graves was as a way of eliminating some of the evidence. But fortunately for the Allied powers and for the State of Israel following World War II, the Germans were not able to get rid of the evidence. They left extensive records, and this is what helped the Allied powers in the Nuremberg laws, in the Israeli government in the years following the establishment of the State of Israel and the collapse of the Nazi Party, in rounding up members of the SS, individuals like Adolf Eichmann that fled justice, and to bring them to trial. So I would like to thank you for joining me today for this lecture on Europe during the interwar years. It's an area very rich in information that we need to study. Understanding the impact of economic crises on societies, understanding how we kind of started on the path that eventually took us into World War II, the rise of fascism, how fascist regimes usually exploit and isolate societies and catastrophes to amass power. And of course, it's important to study because we see the rise of the Communist Party in Russia, political power that would be one of the two major powers in the Cold War. And of course, we see the rise of Adolf Hitler, which provides us a case study in the ills of not only fascism, not only totalitarianism and authoritarianism, but also in racism and eugenics policies as well.